Welcome to a bonus episode of Case Unsolved, where we'll address some comments and questions about Desiree Michaud that we've received on our Facebook group and through email. I'm joined by reporter Karen Florin to help answer some of those questions. And we'll also introduce some additional information we got since recording the last Desiree episode. We originally weren't able to get an interview with current law enforcement, but after publishing the first two episodes, Groton Town Detective Heather Beauchamp and State Prosecutor Christa Baker sat down with us to talk about the Michaud case. So Karen, welcome.
Hi, Carlos. Thank you.
There were a few questions and comments related to the murder investigation itself, the crime scene, who could have been a suspect, who should have been a suspect, who should still be a suspect, and one obvious name that people mentioned on Facebook was George Harris, also known as, was referred to as Angel in the investigation as well. We responded to that on Facebook, Karen, trying to clarify that as best as we know it from speaking to former detectives, that George Harris is no longer an active suspect. Is that fair to say?
So the police will never tell you that they've ruled somebody out because they might get some information someday that says, oh, George Harris was our guy. But from what we know, Harris took the polygraph in the hours after Desiree Michaud was killed, and he probably passed it. So right now, they don't have what they need to charge him, and they haven't charged him. And I don't get the idea that he is the strongest or the only suspect out there.
And in some of our reporting shortly after the murder, it sounded like he was pretty cooperative as well with the police.
Right, I think that Harris probably gave the police names of some of the people in Desiree's life. They would probably go back to him pretty regularly and said, what about this person? What about that person? I'm thinking that they had him complete a timeline of her activity to the best of his knowledge, and maybe even write that down in a statement. And I'm sure that's still part of the file today.
And just to remind people, he was the person that found Desiree in the motel room, and then I believe alerted the front desk person, and that person called the police. So he was there, as far as we know, he was there when the police arrived.
Right. So George Harris, again, a.k.a. Angel, was her boyfriend and police say her pimp. And he was, according to Mike Lewin, he was very upset in the immediate aftermath of her death.
He was upset. I mean, he wasn't, sitting in a chair crying, but you could tell he was upset. And he hadn't been with her during the night. I think he might have seen her a couple of times, but he was doing his own thing.
So related to George Harris, someone also on our Facebook page wanted to know who the room, the motel room at the flagship, who the room was registered to. Do we know that?
Right. So I believe it was Matt Morton told us when we asked that question, he said it must have been Harris. His name was on the room card that the clerk provided to the police.
At around 4 a.m., at that time, a black male known as George Harris, it was written on his room card, so he must have rented the motel room. He told the clerk that the room in room 114 was dead, and then she called the police.
Another question that came up about the murder scene investigation was someone asked or wondered that there must have been some surveillance camera footage somewhere. I responded to that person as the best I could, making the point that in 1984, surveillance camera footage wasn't as widely used as it is today. Now,
I think it was Mike Lewin that said that, there weren't a lot of cameras around.
There was there's no surveillance cameras back then. We solved a homicide with I worked on, we solved with a surveillance camera had audio, and there was nothing then.
And that sort of leads me back into some more questions that we had from listeners in terms of, but what about DNA? That's the first thing I think that people go to. And we asked the same questions, of course. And when we talked to Detective Beauchamp, she told us, sure, we have evidence, but we didn't know how to preserve things back then, the way that they needed to be preserved in order to be tested properly at the laboratory and then to hold up as evidence in court.
And with older cases, your chances of getting that hit on DNA, they're less because of the reasons we talked about. Preservation. We didn't know how to preserve. We didn't know this had to be refrigerated. We didn't know this had to be in plastic. So your evidence degrades.
So it sounds like DNA would be a long shot in terms of helping solve the murder of Desiree Michaud.
So let's talk about Detective Heather Beauchamp and prosecutor Christa Baker. We met with them at the Groton Town Police Department, and we had the opportunity to ask them about a couple of cases, but specifically about the Desiree Michaud case. Can you tell us a little bit about what we learned from them?
So Christa Baker would be the state's attorney who prosecuted anybody who was charged with Desiree Michaud's murder, and she has been actively following the investigation at least for several years. They've talked about how they went to Canada once to follow up a lead on it. And then she talked a little bit about Heather Beauchamp's more recent excursion to Texas. She also wanted us to make clear that, while people might think they know who did this, and I will add there that we've had several different theories come into us, all of which look at different people.
So can you share some of these theories?
Sure. One person who called me said he and others have always thought it was a revenge killing done by someone that was related to a man who had been charged with sexually assaulting Desiree. Another person I talked to said, everybody knew it was a person who lived on a houseboat. At least one other person mentioned the cowboy, the man who wore the cowboy clothing, who was always seen around downtown New London. They described him as a man who was very quiet, didn't say much, but was always there. Mike Lewin said he suspected a person with a reputation for violence toward prostitutes, but he said nobody agreed with him. That person has since died. And then one person told me that he had always thought Michael Ross was the person responsible for Desiree's death. Michael Ross, as you know, is a serial killer, the last person executed in Connecticut, who was active during that time in the early 1980s, but he typically would pick up women hitchhikers and kill them outside. So he would sexually assault them and strangle them outdoors and leave their bodies. And as we know, Desiree was killed in her motel room. People might think they know who did it, but the prosecutor needs to have a standard of proof in order to sign an arrest warrant. She went over that standard of proof called probable cause.
So the standard of proof required for an arrest warrant to be signed or for an officer to make an arrest on site is probable cause. And probable cause is, I guess the best way to explain it would be facts and circumstances which would lead a reasonable person, in this case an officer, or a prosecutor or a judge to believe that it's probable that the crime occurred, or most likely that the crime occurred.
And then she talked about the standard of proof that would be needed to find a person guilty in court, and that's beyond a reasonable doubt.
So once a warrant is signed or an arrest is made, the person is arrested and it comes into our court. And if the case does not plead out, the proof beyond a reasonable doubt would be the standard required for a conviction at the time of trial.
A lot of prosecutors say, I won't even sign a warrant unless I think that I can prove that beyond a reasonable doubt in court. Attorney Baker, interestingly enough, said, I'll sign a warrant if I am confident that the police will be able to do the work required, to strengthen the case after an arrest.
Well, every prosecutor is different. Some prosecutors, depending on, and it does depend on the charges in a case too, but obviously for a cold case like this, it would be a homicide. So we do like something more than the probable cause because we know the difficulty that lies in getting from the probable cause to the proof beyond a reasonable doubt. We look, and this is much to, I think, the frustration of police officers, we look to as nearly close as possible to that beyond a reasonable doubt, because we're thinking 10 steps ahead. Like, I'm sitting at a jury trial right now, and all the evidence I have is in this warrant. Am I going to be able to get a conviction? If the answer is no, a lot of times we don't like to sign those warrants. There is some leeway there, and again, every prosecutor is different. I tend to be a little less strict on that, and I tend to be, give my police officers a little more. I have a lot of confidence in them, and I know that if we get that warrant signed and it looks really good, and I think I can win it, I know that if there's something more that needs to be done or further investigation, that they will hop out and they will complete the investigation.
Detective Beauchamp and Prosecutor Baker also talked to us a little bit about frustrations that law enforcement sometimes feel with these cold cases, and both of them shared their thoughts on the Michaud case in particular.
We've put in a number of years, and I can think, I've been working on this case for so long, my Lord, can something just break here, just go my way. I've been involved in all these other homicides and all these other cold cases for other departments, and can someone just break in my case? And not to be selfish by any means, but you always get more personally attached to your cases. So these are my cases and Christa's cases, so you do have that higher level of wanting to solve them. So every day, you just hope maybe this will be the day. You always hope in cold cases that maybe your evidence isn't going to come through. And with older cases, your chances of getting that hit on DNA, they're less.
I think almost every cold case that I've covered at trial depended on witnesses and informants and not on physical evidence, contrary to popular opinion, right? We think it's DNA always that goes and finds the right person. And while that does happen in some cases, with these cold cases, it's more or less somebody comes forward, provides information, the police build on that a little bit, then they confront the suspect, maybe get a confession, maybe not. They build a case with witnesses and circumstantial evidence and not physical evidence.
You really, really depend on people, and people who decide to do the right thing. And that's what you can hope. And that's what I hope every day, is that if somebody knows something about these cases, maybe it's the time. Maybe today will be the day that they think, I'm going to do the right thing. Because some people have a different view on cold cases and say, cops solve cold cases because of all this evidence and testing. Absolutely not. From my experience, it's how investigators find the right people, and talk to people, and develop relationships with people enough for them to trust you and decide at some point in their life that this is the time where they're going to do the right thing and tell you something they know that helps you in your case.
And Prosecutor Baker also talked about her kind of personal connection to Desiree's case and her kind of, I think she mentioned that she thought that, perhaps, who knows, but perhaps Desiree, knowing that she had aspirations to become an artist and to perhaps leave her life as a prostitute, that, that it's kind of a, that perhaps she might have accomplished that.
She was had something very sad and very beautiful about her. So you do look at her and her lifestyle, and you wonder, in some ways, what could have been, or what should have been had life been different for her. And it is a sad case, I think, in many ways. That happens with a lot of cases. It's hard not to, put yourself either in the family member's position or the victim's position and say, what opportunities was this victim given? What could have been for her had life been a little bit different? And, with her artwork and her being so young, it's tough. It is tough to say what could have been, because I do feel like in her case that, maybe she would have been okay she'd been given the opportunity to live another 5-10 years. Maybe she would have been able to get out from her situation and lived a meaningful and productive life. So it is sad, and it is frustrating not to be able to get that justice for her.
And to hear a prosecutor say that is really very interesting, because on a daily basis she sees dozens of people, right, that are charged with crimes. And so you might get an idea of who can make it out of that revolving door and who can't. And like others, she saw that Desiree Michaud had such great potential to really leave the world of the streets and live an interesting and, law-abiding life.
Another common theme or question that has come up on our Facebook page has been the question of Desiree's art. Her artistic ability was a big part of her story. And one question that people often ask is there any art that we've seen that they would like to see? What do we know about the art that may still remain in possession maybe of the police? What can you tell us about that?
So Detective Beauchamp told us that she didn't think there was as much art there as the family thinks there is there. She mentioned a photo album, and she was looking through everything has been digitized and put on discs that could be put on discs. So she had promised to look through that and to see if she could find what she thought was maybe one picture that they might have. And she also said that when she has time, she would look in the actual evidence, locker or wherever the items are stored, and see what she could find there. So I just reached out to her as recently as today, and she is working a different shift, and she just hasn't been able to do it at this point. On the episode, I said, maybe someday. So maybe someday we will get to see.
So we may have an update later on that as well. And on the other aspect of her art that people ask about is the mural that she painted at York. We happen to also get a comment from a former corrections officer, Sandra Kenny, who recalled seeing the mural.
It was a large wall. It was beautifully done. She signed it on the bottom.
Sandra is somebody that I know from other stories that I've worked on.
That's right. She was a very sweet girl. And that's all she cared about was art.
She told me during our conversation that women would come into the building that the mural was in and look at it and say, wow, who did that?
Well, when you'd open the door was just like a double door, and you'd go in. You got to remember, these buildings were really old. And you'd go in and you'd be taken aback. You wouldn't expect to see something so beautiful in that surrounding. You're in a prison, you're in a jail. You wouldn't expect to see that. And they would ask, oh, it's so beautiful, and who did the who did the artwork and whatever. Eventually they found out, or, if it was someone that was, the recidivism, of course they knew. I'd tell them, oh, remember Desiree, and Desiree did that when she was here. And then afterwards, well, she came to a bad end and whatever. And I can't remember. I know it wasn't the hands reaching out for one hand to the other. I'm trying to think it, but it was very peaceful.
The odd thing was that when I asked her specifics about the mural, which we've heard before, we've heard that it's two hands, it's one hand reaching out to another hand.
Right. A pair of hands reaching towards each other through prison bars is what I remember the description being. And I believe one pair of hands was African American and the other one was Caucasian. And in one of the archived articles from the day, writer Susan Zakin wrote a feature on the 1 year anniversary of her murder, where George Harris also said that he believed that the hands represented his own hands and Desiree's hands.
So Sandra couldn't describe the mural in any specificity, but when I said, well, then how do you know that this was Desiree Michaud's mural, she said, oh, she signed it. She said it said Desiree at the bottom, and everybody knew who did that mural. She was there in the later 80s, so Desiree would have already been killed, but the mural was lasted for quite some time.
And it was painted over, is what we've learned. Well, if there is any other update about her artwork or about the investigation, we will be sure to record another episode and let all our listeners know about it. In the meantime, we're getting ready to move on to the next case, the next cold case for the podcast series. And if you have any other questions about the series, about the Desiree Michaud case in particular, please email us at caseunsolved@theday.com, or if you're not already a member, join our Facebook group at facebook.com/groups/Case Unsolved, and we'll try to respond to any comments, any questions on the Facebook group. If you have a tip about Desiree Michaud's murder, please contact the Groton Town Police at 860-441-6716 or the New London State's Attorney's Office at 860-443-2835. Case Unsolved is produced by Peter Wappy and me, Carlos Virgen. Reporting was done by Karen Florin. Editing and audio mixing by Peter Wappy. Tim Cotter is executive producer, and Sassy Larinetta is associate producer. I produce the music used in the series. This has been a production of The Day in New London, Connecticut.